I had Shahid Buttar on the other day, and he said something about there's a difference between property destruction and violence, and a lot of people are using those terms interchangeably. So I just want to know what you thought, Samalisa and then Assad, about the way people are describing this violence as violence, I should say. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a deflective tactic. I think it's about gaslighting. I think that what we need to be focusing on is why is it that everybody saw that 8-minute video of George Floyd being murdered by the state, and why isn't there more indignation around that? I think we need to put the question on its head and put the energy and the focus where it needs to be, because this is why there's so much unrest right now. If that hadn't happened, we wouldn't see all of these protests all over the country. And I think that, we need to stop criminalizing these protests, because these are our First Amendment rights to be able to protest and engage in acts of civil disobedience. So that's where I stand on. I think that we need to focus the attention where it needs to be.
And have you been out protesting a lot?
Yeah, like I said earlier, I've been to about 4 protests here in the Bronx that have been beautiful, signs of solidarity, marching in the streets. And one of the things that struck me is there was a cleanup the other day, last Tuesday, and because there was some rioting that took place, and some of the businesses were impacted. And then the next day, there was people in the community that came together, maybe 200 people just showed up to board back the businesses, to be there in solidarity, and it was a beautiful event. And then the amount of police presence that I saw was so intense. It was so significant. And I was like, well, this is why we need to defund the police. And then I was talking to people that were at that cleanup, and I was like, well, were you around here the night before when, things were happening? What were the cops doing then? Were they protecting and serving? What were they doing? And a lot of people were saying, well, they would just drive by and not do anything. And, the next day when there's beautiful acts of solidarity in the community, they're there in full force. And to me, that's a waste of funding. Because it's if you're organizing something that's based on love and it's based on unity and it's a positive thing, why do you need to have so much police presence?
Yeah.
That's what I've been seeing at the protests.
Right. Asad, do you want to respond? Because you've been at a lot of protests, right? Based on your Twitter.
I'd say I've been to about 2 or 3 demonstrations per day, because they're constantly happening, and they're happening all over the place. And sometimes you just hear one happening, and even when I've decided to take the day off, I feel like I have to go out. And they're all very different. They all change.
I just want to clarify, Assad's not protest shaming anyone. He's not running for office, so he doesn't have as much to do.
Yeah. I'm just a miscreant, I just I just go out to protest. So I would say I've observed a lot of different things happening at these protests, and there are many ways in which the media representations are misleading, and there are many contradictions in the protests. I think that the point that your previous guest made is very important. Property destruction is not the same as violence. Harming property is not the same as harming people. If people are engaged in a protest and they knock over a trash can to build a barricade to prevent the police from coming and chasing them with clubs, that's not violence. That's one strategy of trying to defend yourself from police. And I think it's not appropriate to condemn that. I think that that's a decision some people will make, and there can be a debate about the appropriate tactics to pursue in the street. But the important thing to note is that police violence happens when there is any kind of demonstration that is questioning the existing order, that's questioning the status quo. you cannot blame police violence on the behavior of protesters. Even if protesters don't engage in property destruction, it's entirely possible that they'll be met with police violence. And the only people responsible for police violence are the police. That's the fundamental point that everyone has to remember. Police violence is unacceptable, and when it happens, the people responsible are the police. Now, when property destruction happens, it's also a complicated thing. Property destruction in the Bronx is different from property destruction in Soho. When there's property destruction and looting happening in Soho by people who probably would not even have been allowed into these shops, I think that, once again, we're not in a position to pass moral judgment on these activities. We are in the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression. We have astronomical rates of unemployment. The level of deprivation that people are experiencing right now is extreme. And looting is in many cases a rational response to that situation. So instead of being in a position of trying to pass a moral judgment about looting, we have to understand how things like that are inevitable in a situation of such extreme economic inequality, such extreme deprivation, and when people are pushed into a level of action by this kind of state repression that goes beyond what happens on an everyday basis. People have been pushed into this position. And it's not our place to pass moral judgment on it. We have to understand the inevitability of it. And we have to say, in the end, I believe we have to say that acts of rebellion against the status quo are ultimately better than complacency.
Okay.
Whatever form they take.
Whatever form they take.